6 мая, накануне своей очередной инаугурации, так называемой,
On May 6th, on the eve of another of his so-called inaugurations, Vladimir Putin ordered tactical nuclear weapons drills. Russian nuclear threats can be heard fairly regularly these days, but such drills haven't been held since the fall of the Soviet Union. That same day, the deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, announced that this was an answer to the calls of Western politicians to send forces into Ukraine and strike Russian territory. The Ministry of Defense announced that the drills would be held in the southern military district close to Ukraine. 2 weeks before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the American scientist Ira Helfand, in an article for the journal The Nation, warned that a conflict in this region could lead to the use of nuclear weapons. Does such a risk exist now? Has the nuclear threat risen, and by how much? We have with us Ira Helfand, a participant of anti-nuclear initiatives and a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 and 2017, via video today. Hello and welcome. It's nice to see you on TV Rain. First, I'd like to ask you how much the threat of nuclear war has risen since 2022. Have your fears been justified?
I think the situation has become more dangerous since 2022. The latest round of threats by President Putin and former President Medvedev were really quite extraordinary and very worrisome and dangerous. And the situation in Ukraine is not the only potential area where nuclear conflict could break out. The relations between the United States and China are also very worrisome, as is the situation in South Asia and the situation on the Korean Peninsula. But the situation in Ukraine, I think, demands our attention the most at the moment.
When Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev and other Russian officials or those close to the Kremlin make announcements about Russia's nuclear readiness, is this just rhetoric or an actual threat of nuclear war?
I think we can't know for sure. Simply making the threats is, in fact, in a certain way, using nuclear weapons. Russia has been using the threat of using nuclear weapons to try to deter countries from coming to Ukraine's support. And this is something that the United States has done in the past as well. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, it made it very clear that the phrase was, all options are on the table. Everyone knew that meant the U.S. was threatening that if needed, it would use its nuclear arsenal. So at that level, the Russian Federation is already using its nuclear weapons. Will it actually use them on the battlefield? I think that's less clear, but I don't think we should dismiss these threats because we can't be certain what they mean, and they're extremely dangerous. Any use of nuclear weapons would be a catastrophe in its own right and would almost certainly lead to an escalation to a large-scale nuclear war, which would be a catastrophe for all of humanity. So we need to take these threats very seriously.
If these threats are taken seriously, how should Western governments react? What should the leaders of the US and other countries, those that have nuclear weapons and those that don't, do? Can the West wield any influence over what's happening?
I think what the West needs to do is to try to change the entire terms of the conversation. The current situation in Ukraine is very unstable, and the West's ability to affect what Vladimir Putin does is somewhat limited. What we need to do is to have a broad international initiative that stigmatizes nuclear weapons completely and says they must be eliminated. And the United States needs to state clearly, along with the other countries in NATO, that nuclear weapons do not make us safe, that they are the greatest threat to our security. And when I say us, I mean all of humanity. And that it is urgently in the interests of all countries, including the Russian Federation, to eliminate all nuclear weapons from the planet. Nuclear weapons make the countries that have them more powerful, but they do not make the countries that have them safer. And again, that includes the Russian Federation. Putin is playing with fire. If he pushes us over the edge accidentally, this will be the end of Russia as a country, as well as the end of every other country on the planet. So it is time for us all to stand up and say, enough of this craziness. We cannot continue to gamble with the future of humanity in this way. We need to stop threatening to use nuclear weapons. We need to eliminate nuclear weapons once and for all, so this danger is removed from our future.
But how can this be done when the Russian Federation clearly isn't planning on turning away from nuclear weapons? This sounds like utopia that's clearly unachievable. The West might want this, but countries like Russia won't willingly sign on to such deals. So what can be done?
I don't know that it's utopian at all. I think that it is in Russia's interest to eliminate its nuclear weapons. President Putin may not understand that at the moment, but clearly it is not in Russia's interest to have a nuclear war, which will destroy the country completely. In the 1980s, when President Gorbachev reached out to the United States and proposed that we end the Cold War arms race, I suspect he had little expectation that the United States would respond favorably. The United States was talking at that point in very bellicose terms about being able to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. We, the United States, had just deployed Pershing missiles in Germany explicitly to be able to fight such a war. And yet, when Gorbachev reached out to Reagan, they were both
Да,
able to
83.
see the urgent need to get rid of these weapons. And so I don't think we should dismiss out of hand the possibility that the Russian leadership could also come to understand the extreme danger that it poses to itself by maintaining a nuclear arsenal and the urgent need for Russia also to eliminate its nuclear weapons. I don't propose that the United States or the West disarm unilaterally. I propose that the United States exercise leadership and reach out to the other countries in the hopes that we can achieve a solution. There's no guarantee this will succeed, but there's also no downside to trying. The worst that happens is that Russia says no, and we're back in the same situation we're in today. But that's a terrible place to be. And so we have to hope that such an initiative would receive a favorable response.
Возникнет проблема с доверием.
But it could be worse if problems with trustworthiness arise, which are already clearly evident. The relations between Russia and the West are similar to those during the Cold War. But I wanted to ask you, in light of your experience, how do you see the theoretical use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine? As far as I understand, Ukraine's territory is the most likely place for Russia to conduct a tactical nuclear strike. What would this look like? Or perhaps you think it would be done with strategic and not tactical nuclear weapons?
I think either of these is a possibility if the situation becomes extremely unstable.
М,
Uh, Part of the problem during a war is that things don't go as planned, and we get into unintended consequences. Russia might use a tactical nuclear weapon if it feels that it needs to do that to achieve its goals on the battlefield. That weapon, the definition of tactical is largely a question of where the weapon is used. That may appear to be a tactical nuclear weapon to the Russians, and it may appear to be a strategic attack to the Ukrainians. So that distinction, I think, it should not be relied on too much as a firewall to keep this conflict from escalating. I'm not sure the specific circumstances under which Russia would use its nuclear weapons. The threats have been made not only to use them against Ukraine, but to use them against Washington and Paris. So it's not clear what is going on in President Putin's mind at this point. But we have to hope that he is able to see the extreme folly of using nuclear weapons and the extreme folly of continuing to threaten to use them, because they make the situation more unstable and increase the chance that there will be an unintended escalation that will be catastrophic for the entire world.
Если позволите, Айра, чтобы убедить наших зрителей...
I'd then like to ask you, Ira, if you don't mind, to abate the fears of our viewers of the nuclear threat, because I, for example, agree that such a threat exists and that it's serious, and to imagine what such a strike could look like. Let's say everything doesn't go according to plan and Putin makes the decision. How would this turn out, and what would the consequences be?
If the United States and Russia, NATO and Russia, stumble into a nuclear war, something like 200 to 400 million people will die in the first afternoon. The fires caused by these nuclear weapons will cause a catastrophic disruption of climate worldwide that will lead to a famine, which will kill 5 to 6 billion people in the first 2 years. And the famine will continue beyond that. But this is not what needs to happen. The countries which have these weapons know how to dismantle them. They have already dismantled 50,000 of them. They began that process at the height of the Cold War, when tension and mistrust between the Soviet Union and NATO was at its peak. But they were able to see at that time how incredibly dangerous their behavior was and how important it was to change that behavior. Today, there is globally the International Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which provides a way for the entire world to express its demand that the countries which have nuclear weapons end this reckless behavior and eliminate their arsenals. And I think we can only hope that the treaty is universalized, that countries which have nuclear weapons come to their senses and realize that they must, in their own interest, eliminate those nuclear arsenals, and they must sit down together, the 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, and work out the details for a verification regime, an enforcement regime, and a timetable for dismantling their nuclear weapons. It may look as though this is not the right moment for this to happen, given the great tension between Russia and NATO. But let us remember, it was at precisely this kind of a moment, with extreme tension, when we were on the brink of nuclear war in the 1980s, when the leadership came to their senses and realized that they needed to act in a different way. And it is up to citizens in countries where they are able to put pressure on their governments to see reason, to change course, and to deliver us from this existential threat.
But let me clarify, do I understand correctly that if Russia uses nuclear weapons, the West will without a doubt respond? Or could there be a situation where tactical nuclear weapons are used and then there is no response? That is, a mirror response won't occur.
I think we don't know what will happen. In the past, when the US has conducted tabletop computer war games, every time in a conflict between Russia and NATO, every time that a nuclear weapon has been used on the battlefield, it has escalated to large-scale nuclear war. The situation in Ukraine is somewhat different. Ukraine is not a member of NATO and it does not have its own nuclear weapons. And so it is possible that President Putin could use a nuclear weapon there and not have this situation escalate to all-out nuclear war. But I don't think any of us want to take the chance of finding out what would happen because we do not know. And it certainly could escalate
Это правда.
to the ultimate nuclear catastrophe.
Невероятно убедительно.
Very true. Thank you very much. What you're saying sounds very convincing, and I hope that your point comes across to people. Ira Helfand, 1985 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, thank you very much. This all, of course, sounds scary and threatening, and it's hard not to think about, but still important to draw conclusions.